Hello there, my Photoshop children. I just wanted to go over some of the concepts off of Note Sheet 2 that we didn't cover in our selection tools and layer styles lectures. So I've just put this document here. It's me and my kids at Christmas, and I've got one little layer of me, a little cartoon version of me, down here in the corner. I'm going to pull up this and see what it is we already know, and everybody should be pretty comfortable with keyboard shortcuts at this point. Everybody should know how to access the move tool and get those, press Control T and get those handles to resize or rotate, transformation, zooming in and out and bringing up missing panels, renaming layer using the hand, increase and decrease brush, so I'll review that. Clipping masks, which we've done quite a bit. We haven't done much with file formats for Photoshop brushes, shapes, or patterns, so those you probably don't know. We haven't really done much at all with brushes, so I'm going to talk about those today and how to modify the brush angle. But we've certainly hit on lassos and marching ants. So let's go ahead and hit some of this brush information, which will also answer some of these other questions. We have used brushes, and I did show you that brushes indeed do not create their own layers. So you do have to be very careful if you're going to use a brush. For that matter, you've got to make a layer. So if I'm going to draw on something, I'm just going to call this drawing. If I'm going to draw something on a layer using a brush, I'm going to access my brush tool or press B. Up here on the drop down arrow for brushes, we have size and hardness. Now you know what size is, and you also know that you can press those bracket keys up by the letter P to make it bigger or smaller. What you may or may not remember is our brief introduction to the softness or hardness of a brush. So let me take this brush, and I've got it a hardness of 0, which would mean it's very soft, and I just drew with it. Okay, now I'm going to make it a hardness of 100, which will make it a very hard brush, which looks like this. See the difference there? And this matters too when you're using your quick selection. You know, we have a brush there, but we don't get all of the brush options. We do have an option for hardness. So you can mess around sometimes depending on what your image is and mess with that hardness on your quick selection brush too. Now notice if I would have not made a new layer, it doesn't make one on its own. And if I wouldn't have made a new layer, this would have added this to my background layer. So that'd be kind of a bad deal, right? So make sure that you always make a new layer for your drawings so that they don't get glued to whatever layer is there. I really should have all my notifiers turned off. Everything's going nuts. All right, because otherwise they'll get glued together. So if I was on this layer with my girl and I drew on this layer and then I go to pick her up and move her, well, I mean, they're glued together because it doesn't make its own layer. And then I would have to delete that, which of course you'd have to do with an eraser. Now, an eraser in Photoshop is also considered a brush. It's just a brush that erases. So now you can see that I've erased using, again, just a brush, but it's an eraser brush. All right. So that's brushes, just kind of in a nutshell. You can also load brushes if you need additional brush options. So when we click here, if you click on the drop-down arrow and you click on the little play button, you have a variety of different types of brushes. So for instance, square brushes are in here, and I can replace that with square brushes and then have these types of brushes to use. And those, of course, are going to have little boxy edges because they're squares. I'm on a touchpad, so this is absolutely terrible drawing-wise. Things like dry media brushes. As you can see, I get all kinds of different things. Like I have these really, I call them crunchy looking brushes. You can tell more if your brush is bigger, of course, but let me make this brush bigger and kind of, there you go. See? That's a dry media brush. So there's a bunch of different types of brushes in there, and it's kind of fun to play. Like I can just sit around and play with brushes all day. You can also download brushes. So like if you go out to a website, you really honestly can just search for like free Photoshop brushes, but you can also find them on our Z drive. So at school, we have in our Photoshop folder a brushes folder out on the Z drive in my class folder. So you can load up different brushes from there too. But you can go out to websites like Brush Easy, and then they've got a bunch of different brushes, dirt brushes and splatter brushes and stuff like that. And when you click on a brush, it's certainly going to have to be downloaded to use, and they're usually zipped. meaning they're all in a file together. So when you hit download and it downloads it down there, it'll be a zip file, and you'll have to open that zip file and then move that brush. I usually just move it to my pictures folder. But what you're looking for, if they're brushes, they're ABR files. Here's an answer to one of your questions. Brushes are ABR files. I don't know what the A stands for. I guess the BR stands for brush. It's a brush. I don't know. How about that? To use a brush, so usually I just drag these and I put them over in my folder for pictures. And that way, if you want to load it later, you've got it there. Some people will make a folder on their U drive for brushes too. But to use a brush, you just double click it, and then it automatically should load up in Photoshop. So now at the bottom of my list of current brushes, I should then have those brushes. Now, sometimes it doesn't work. They don't make a new category. So if you downloaded a brush and it doesn't load, then you're going to go to load brushes. And that's typically the way most people will do it. So let's do that. So I'm going to come back out here. I've already downloaded my brush and opened the file. I'm just going to move it to my pictures folder like I told you is good to do. And then we go into Photoshop and load the brush. So you click on the play button, the down arrow, play button, and load brushes. Then go out to your folder. In this case, I put it in the pictures folder. And then there's my ABR file, my brush. Now it's added to the bottom of this list of brushes, so I have all of these. The numbers underneath tell you how big the brushes are. In this case, it's a pretty big brush. Of course, I can size it down and all that too. The picture's getting out of control here, so I'm just gonna turn the eyeball off on this layer and this layer, and make a new layer. Put this on. Okay, so there we go. Now we've paintballed my face. Now I'm gonna undo this and show you something else. And that is, if you want to pre-rotate a brush, you can do it a different way. Now, certainly, I can use the brush like a stamp, which is what I've done so far. Just click it like that. But if I wanted it to be a different direction, of course, I'd have to click it. It'd have to be the only thing on the layer, and I could press Control-T, right? And then I could rotate it through. I could even make it smaller or bigger. But if you want to be able to have that control from the beginning, what you can do is bring up the brush panel. So go to Window, and brush, and then this is the panel for brush. So what you're looking at is this thing that looks like a compass. So like I point over here, I'll point at her face so you can kind of see where things are. If I take this arrow and I move it, it's also rotating the brush. See how the brush is starting to rotate around? See now it's like sideways. That's a way to rotate your brush. And of course you can also change your size of the brush the normal way. All right, so that's the brush panel. There's a lot of other fancy things you can do in here too that we won't do just yet. All right, so that kind of gives you a good overview of brushes. So brushes, ABR is the file format if you download a brush file. Also about brushes here, we say that brushes do not create their own layers. We talked about that already. And hardness and softness, that's in here someplace as well of the brush. So hard brush, if it's 100% hard, it's got straight edges. If it's 0% hard, it's really fuzzy around the edges. And that's basically how that works. All right, so that's brushes for you. Let's go ahead, and while I'm at that Brush Easy site, they actually have a lot of other things on this website other than just brushes. So if I go back to their main page and you look through, they have different categories of things. Let's see. Obviously, they also have a lot of pop-ups. Featured free Photoshop patterns. So patterns is another thing we can use. Notice here's a fancy little paisley pattern. And we've used patterns before. You've used them as pattern overlays, and you've also used them on backgrounds. But patterns, you can click on free download again. You're going to download it in a zip, so you're going to have to open it up and drag it out of the folder once you get it. But in this case, I'm going to open it up and get into the folder. And pattern files are PAT files. PAT. So again, I'm going to just drag this into my pictures folder because that's just the easiest way to deal with these. But you could make a folder on your U drive. And then I can load up my pattern. So depending on what I'm doing, like if I have I'll just make like a rectangle or whatever. It makes its own layer. If I do a pattern overlay on my layer style, Then I come to the little drop down for the pattern and hit the play button. That's always how it works. And then load patterns. And then go out to your pictures folder. And there's my pattern. And then it'll add it to the list. And there's my paisley pattern. And then I can use it inside. Notice this is a transparent pattern, so it keeps the background color that I had on my shape in there. You can also scale your pattern. There's a scale button here, so you can make it smaller and it'll repeat itself, or you can make it bigger or whatever, depending on how you're using it. So that's how patterns work. And there are, of course, many types of patterns that are built in categories too. But you can download patterns and use them as well. Some patterns are better than others. Oh, let me add one more thing here on patterns. I'll just put that one back on. There is a thing on here called fill. And fill has to do with that fill color. So that green we see in there, if I want to make it clear and see-through, I can turn the fill down. Now don't confuse fill with opacity. The opacity of a layer is how see-through the layer is. So if I turn the opacity down, the whole thing starts to become transparent. But if I turn the fill down, that's only the color. Now, when you mess with the fill, it doesn't hurt any layer styles. So if I had a stroke on this, like around the outside edges, for instance, that stroke and that pattern overlay will not be affected by that fill being removed. So I'll still have the box around it and I'll still have the pattern inside, but I lose the color, and that's how that works. All right, that takes care of patterns. Oh, apparently I have a button to click here, so everything's going nuts. Okay, we'll just go with it. Type and shape layers. You can't erase those. You really don't need to erase those, but let's say, for instance, that I wanted to, because I'm crazy. I wanted to erase this shape. Well, you can't erase type or shape layers because they're their own special layers. That's why they have, they don't look like checkerboards like these other layers. So if you're going to make a layer a normal layer where you can actually interact with it with an eraser, we call that rasterizing the layer, which is kind of like flattening the layer, and it's no longer editable where it doesn't lose quality. So, but now I have that taken care of. So if I erase, it will change my shit. Now notice my layer styles are not messed with. So I still have my layer styles going on. So it's just reshaping where the stroke goes based on my shape, or based on my drawing here, my erasing. But now it's different. See, the quality's not great, so it's not like you would really want to do this too often. But there are certain times where you might want to grunge out a letter or something, and you've got a letter on there that you want to mess with. And to be able to erase it, you would have to rasterize it. So that's yet another thing that you need to be aware of. Once layers are rasterized, if you resize them to be bigger, they are going to lose quality. So once you rasterize a layer for shape or letters, they're not going to be as crisp and clear as before. We could make our fonts like super big before, but once you rasterize them, you're not going to be able to do that so much. All right, a couple of other little bitty things here. The last one really that I need to get into is Photoshop shapes, and I talked about it to some of you in here with regards to shapes. You already know how to get to shapes, and you already know that you can click on the blobby shape, and that gives you more shapes. But just like patterns and brushes, you can load shapes. So if you've downloaded a shape files, by the way, are CSH files. And I have some of those out on the drive too. But if you load up your shapes, more shapes to choose from other than the original ones. And you can see here, I've got, these are the different shapes that I loaded in this particular one. And then now I have some fancy little button shapes. And of course, right now they've still got my pattern overlay in there, and I've still got my fill turned down, but there you go. So you can download shapes too. Finally, let me go ahead over drop shadow because I'm getting hit by the clock here. Whenever you add a drop shadow, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but there's a box that says use global light. So if you have a big drop shadow on something and then you add a drop shadow to something else on a different layer, the shadows always match. So if you've changed the angle or you've moved that shadow around, it's going to do it on every single layer that has a shadow. So if you don't want that, you'll uncheck use global light. All right, that should mostly cover this page for you. So hopefully you've got all your notes for note sheet 2. Now check the website